The problem of diplomacy is usually it's a code, and the last step of the code is the war. You know, in a sense, you started by say, I deplore, it's a first message, I regret, and so on, but at the end, people have to take it seriously, because at the end, you have a stick. It will be sanctions, or it will be retortions, and maybe war. So that's a bit, you know, really sending codes to avoid the worst. We, the European countries, we have suffered so much from the wars that we have tried in a sort of Kantian way, we have tried to overcome the war by creating European Union. European Union is against the war, is to solve the German problem, in a sense to make war impossible, you know, by uniting the countries, the economies. So that was the idea of Jean Monnet, or the founding fathers of the European Union, to make the war impossible, to create a sort of postmodern zone. The problem is that we are, of course, European countries, we are the only ones to be like this. We are postmodern in a modern world. And it's a bit dangerous. And it's not because we are trying to forget history that history is forgetting us. It's true that a lot of European countries consider, in a sense, that the use of force is dirty. In a sense that history is dirty, and that now they are living in a sort of social security world, far from the scenes of the real world. And that's, again, that could be dangerous. I think, and we are back to what I was saying in the beginning, war is always possible. And we have had war on our continent 15 years or 20 years ago, and we don't know what will happen in 1 or 2 generations. And secondly, we have also to defend our interest beyond our borders. And so we could have to use force. Or we could have to use force for humanitarian reasons, you know, really to prevent a genocide or to prevent massive massacres. So I think that's a real question mark, which is in front of the Europeans. What do they want to be? A club of retired seniors, or a continent living in the world? And which means, you know, there is something we say in French, if you don't have hands, your hands are never dirty. And I think the Europeans have chosen so far, a lot of Europeans prefer not to have hands.
Traditionally and historically, peace simply meant a situation where you didn't have war. And the main development between from a historical situation to present days is that in the days of Kant, and perhaps even by Kant himself, war was considered as the normal state of affairs, and peace was something that had to be achieved by artificial means up to a certain point. And nowadays, I think the principle on which the United Nations is based, that any kind of use of force is basically not permitted except under circumstances of legitimate self-defense. So basically war has been outlawed as a means of politics, and the normal state of affairs should be peace.
Well, I mean, standing armies were not abolished. Of course, it would be a nice idea to come to terms with each other, so that standing armies become superfluous. And there are countries that don't have standing armies. There are a few countries. I mean, there is Costa Rica, for example, which doesn't have a standing army, and which has proved great. Costa Rica was the only country in Central American turmoils that was not affected by the turmoils in Central America, whereas all the other countries with standing armies have been going through an extremely violent history in the last half century, or even longer. So that can be used as a strong point that Kant was right in the suggestion to abolish standing armies. Now, this is definitely what we, from our Dessa standpoint, would promote. You know, come to a world where standing armies become superfluous.
I think one of the real lessons of the last decade is that we are all looking for a framework to manage affairs between the peoples of the world. Warfare has become so randomized, so mercenary, and there's no method yet to find a mechanism to control the irrationality of modern armed conflict. One of the risks today, I think, that's felt around the world in growing degree is the risk that states are losing control of the game. The real important influence makers in the world of the future might not be our governments, but might be international companies, other interests that could be game-changing in the way that they conduct their affairs, that may not be looking out for the masses. We can imagine a conglomerate interest of private capital in the future that will have as one of its faces a private army that might, say, seek to exploit water resources in a part of the world where they are scarce, that might put a private army in place to wage a civil war against a regime with which it is in disfavor in some other part of the world. We're at a tipping point in the capacity and volition of states to regulate the most powerful. There was a time in the West, particularly in Europe and in North America, where it was alleged that states were simply in bed, if you will, with corporate interests, that they were doing what was good for Wall Street or what was good for General Motors was good for the United States, and never should a government take a policy that would cut against the interest of those entities. I don't believe that that's the world we live in today, but we live in a world where states are losing their ability to control the private actors because they may simply act outside the sphere of sovereign authority with impunity.
So what is it that is changing today with a nation state? I think that the irony of corporate neoliberal globalization is that it represents a new kind of internationalism compared with the internationalism that we had, say, in the prior era, which included the two world wars. There was a lot of internationalism, but it was an internationalism that saw the international as somehow there outside. The current period installs globalities, mostly for neoliberal economic projects, inside countries. So if we recall Keynes, who was an internationalist in the famous Bretton Woods meeting, Keynes' notion was an internationalism that was there to protect national economies from excessive international fluctuations. That means you protect the national. Now he wanted, for him, doing this also meant that national states, which largely conduct themselves as private actors, the national behind them is their private domain, rather than being oriented to a shared commons. What Keynes had in mind was that national states would then become more concerned with the commons. That didn't happen. Neither of those two things that he wanted happened, partly because the United States wanted basically to have a free hand for its corporations. But today, I think, because of neoliberal economics, there is a kind of interesting situation where parts of the national state, especially the most powerful parts, the executive branch of government, have actually become sort of denationalized. They have one foot in the global and one foot in the national. Once this emergent internationalism becomes part of the most powerful branch of so-called liberal democracies, can that internationalism in the hands of a different type of governing class be oriented towards a genuine internationalism of the commons?
But you know, he says one thing that I think is very interesting. You know, when he makes his distinction between republic and democracy, and he has a mistrust regarding democracy because he imagines democracy as it is etymologically, that is the power of demos, of the people. So he imagines a pack of despots wielding power. But I think that actually he senses something that we meet in reality. When you have those larger institutions with, let's say, I don't know, 1,000 representatives, etc., it works very in a very difficult way, because there are traces of tyranny, despotism, and ambition in each individual who is supposed to work for the collective well-being. So it's true that the enemy is laziness. There's somewhere Kant points at the vice of laziness and cowardice, and you know, this has been picked up by Kafka in one of his aphorisms. He says that because of laziness and cowardice we've lost paradise, and because of cowardice and laziness we won't recover paradise.
To a large extent, sovereignty today consists of the power to dictate who will move and who cannot move. In a context in which we are moving towards forms of planetary surveillance, most of which are in tune with the, on the one hand, robotic forms of warfare, and on the other hand, forms of control and surveillance which are more and more biologized and digitalized.
I think one of the deepest insights of the tradition of reflection on cosmopolitanism that in many ways Kant is central to in the Enlightenment, in the European Enlightenment, is the recognition that thinking of yourself as bound together with the whole species, with all of us, thinking of yourself as in some sense a fellow citizen of all human beings, is completely consistent with thinking of yourself as also a citizen of a particular place. For some reason in the contemporary world, people have moved towards an idea that there's a natural opposition between cosmopolitanism and loyalty to more local things. But if you think about it, that can't be right. There's a historical reason why it can't be right. Nationalism was invented by cosmopolitans. Modern nationalism was invented by cosmopolitans. Herder was a cosmopolitan. He's at the root of German nationalism. Mazzini was a cosmopolitan. He's a central figure in Italian nationalism, and so on. So there's a kind of historical argument. But there's also a philosophical argument, which is just that it's a particular kind of universalism. And the particular kind of universalism that it is a kind of universalism that values the local. Right, because it's about bringing the world together without making everybody the same.
We have to rehabilitate and reactivate the utopian potential written in the concept of the common, and redeploy it not only in attempts in the global effort at taking care of our planet, but also translate it into a set of rights which are inalienable and which apply to any human being, notwithstanding where they were born, what race they belong to, what country they happen to be living in or coming from. And the right to move should be part of those rights. That we, as human beings, we are entitled to mobility, which entails, if only indirectly, the right to hospitality.